Hello, everybody. Welcome to the episode I think I owed a lot of people, and that's the episode regarding deployment and how we're going to tackle this episode today is by talking mostly, it's going to be probably a long one. I'm going to talk about missions, how to approach deployment from the perspective of scoring those missions from both a primary and battle tactic manner. We're going to cover some fundamental, like tips, I would say, about deployment. Not that like they're applicable to basically every mission, and they won't be so focused on what's the word I'm looking for, on how to beat the mission necessarily, but like good. I watch a lot of new player play, and I see a lot of the mistakes in deployment, not necessarily because they're not smart about how they're deploying, but like literally like we're talking about micro things that like could cost them if a good player basically notices that kind of a chink in their defense, right? Because they deployed a little bit too what's the word I'm looking for? Conservatively, or more like they didn't think about like certain vectors of attacks or threat that your opponent has, or they didn't think about engagement and how can basically can disrupt your plan on scoring points in the actual following few turns. So yeah, this episode could be long. We're going to cover all 12 missions and how and some loose advice about how to deploy for those, as well as like those kind of overall deployment tips and tricks. So I'll try to edit the video online to make sure that there is, when we cover each mission, they'll be parceled out for basically for those missions. If you wanted to refer back to a previous state of the video, you want to go try to dig up what the video's basic coverage is. Simultaneously, this week for me is I'm recording this right before I fly out to Pittsburgh for the Team America practice. So you'll see, if you see this on Sunday and you have some questions or comments, I probably won't see them until for a while. So if you apologize if I'm not getting back to anyone super quickly on any of these. It's just mostly because I'll just be out of town for a few days. But let's get right to it. So we're gonna jump right into the favorite of all, Price of Gallet. I don't know about favorite, but it is like kind of like the quintessential mission for Age of Sigmar. So key takeaways right at the gate when you look at this mission, you'll notice there is 5 objectives with basically 3 in the center, 1 in each basically Prelios territory, and the fundamental core of the mission is basically score 1, score 2, score more, and then battle tactics to win. So love this mission. It's probably the best introductory mission you can make for Age of Sigmar because it introduces all the complexity of scoring without actually and a vast number of objectives. 5 is about, I think I won't think it's the average, but I think it's the right amount of objectives on the table in terms of making the game more appealing to the players. And since it's forcing everything to be kind of fought over the center and in the middle, it's just a very good mission. Anyway, we're not here to talk about the quality of those missions. We're here to talk about deployment. So for the most part, and we're going to play this from the defender's perspective. I'm going to assume the defender's perspective. It's not that being an attacker necessarily changes anything, but it's just the way I'm going to draw this on the map. The important thing is when you win the role, or let's say who picks attacker defender, just make sure you ask your opponent like how many drops they are first and how many drops you are. So you have a clear understanding of communication between both players and their full knowledge of like who makes a decision about who wants to go first or not. Now, my advice has always been to try to go second as much as possible because you can mitigate whatever your opponent does the first turn by just deploying smartly, and also because it gives you the opportunity for double into turn 2. Not that you necessarily should take it, but it is like the last thing you want to do is go first, expose yourself, and then your opponent rolls and gets a double and then just wins the game, right? Because that's I think most of the people who feel bad experiences of the double turn mechanic is literally on turn 2 initiative roll. If they just deploy correctly or they played the first turn less aggressively, they probably wouldn't be so punished by it. They wouldn't hate it so much. And then this is not for, once again, not a stream about like defending prior double turn or priority rolls, but it's literally I truly believe that most people have a big gripe with basically the double turns mechanic. It's because of the turn two roll and just play mistakes, really, more than anything. Okay, jumping right into deployment. So, a couple things about what I do, and don't get me wrong, I am not the supreme authority on this, but so firstly, I try to understand if my opponent, how many how many drops my opponent is. Am I gonna go second or first? And usually, what ends up happening is if I'm going to be over, more drops than my opponent, they're usually gonna make me go first, meaning that I have to deploy in a way where I can get points and then react to my opponent's turn without basically forcing myself in a state where he can massively take advantage of having an extra turn into me. So what that means is forcing engagements, not necessarily allowing him to have easy engagements or the ability to move so fast that he can get behind your force state. So let's talk about how you would do that. There's a couple ways of basically approaching this mission. There is one of the things I see a lot of players do on this mission that I think is not the right way is I don't want to do that. I want to. There we go. So I'm getting used to this tool as well. I see a lot of players do kind of like this, right? So they deploy in this corner, the center, and they're like, okay, well, I have choice to go this way, choice to go that way, and then potentially go back this way, or vice versa. It's like turn one, turn two situation. It's not a wrong strategy in terms of deployment, and then because you're trying to understand the flow of how you're going to fight the rest of the game, which is, by the way, I realize I'm saying this, but most people I think don't understand or maybe don't know like that's how you're supposed to approach deployment. It's not about necessarily the immediate reaction of what you do with it. It's how you think you're going to play the rest of the game against based on your opponent's deployment. The advantage of being more drops than your opponent means that you're more likely than not to see how they deploy. So you can kind of counter deploy. It's not really that important to counter deploy. What you need to know though, and this is something that comes to the territory, you just need to know how your opponent's big threats work. What's the reach? What's their what's their impact? How much do you need to care about them? So those are all very important things, more important than basically trying to counter deploy. Just knowing that information means it doesn't really matter where the deploy is if you just base your decisions based on like that threat range. So here's a problem with this this strategy here. So the problem with that deployment is that a smart player would basically recognize that you're not incentivized to fight over any specific thing. You're just choosing one or two. So if you're reactionary, if you're setting up, forcing you to go first, they're looking down the barrel of a double, right? So let's say since the players are most likely than not going to do just move their castle up the center because that's just how you set up yourself so you can react to that. Well, a smart player would just say, well, they can either, depending on like the army type, if it's faster than you and so forth, they'll just go swing here, and then if they double, they just hit you in the rear. And because in this mission, you only need to score 1, 2, and more. It's very easy to do that. If basically your opponent's army is like kind of castly like this, they might use some chaff units to score points here, or in the side objective to score the third one. But that just gives you another ability to get extra movement with your, like if you're going to the bottom of the turn by basically charging those chaff units and using that charge and pile in to set yourself up for even a better double by basically reaching behind. I know there's a lot of things on the screen, so I'm delete that for a second. So how do you approach deployment if you're going first in this mission? My thought process is more you pick a corner. You pick this box here. You either pick here or pick here. And then you dedicate maybe a chaff unit to go whatever corner you didn't fight. So two reasons as to why. When you basically move up center field here, you're basically challenging a triangle of objectives, which is the 3 objectives you care about, really. And most armies really can, you know, you don't want to overextend because you don't want to be basically be giving your opportunity for your opponent to just flank behind you. Uh, but really, it's and then you can just sacrifice a chaff unit if you really need to. But you don't really need to do that turn one. You can just kind of keep it in the back, just kind of like, hey, like if you ever you kind of have to commit some resources to like help hold this thing because I'll just this chaff fast unit here is just going to be a constant annoyance. The idea is that like you're forcing them to even then they want to do this whole like ping pong of like to go around your wall. It's just or like they're gonna force it's harder to do that because there's less basically real estate for them to come up especially on the side. If you're giving them like real estate on both sides they can kind of easily pick one. um, but yeah, I recommend like this approach first, like, and then it's easy to just kind of set up some easy chaff screens here, and then most of your concentrated strength on this corner pocket here. It also forces your opponent to you get to basically play out a grinding game for the first like 2 to 3 turns, and then if you get an opportunity to just burst and then break through and then go contest their objective, it makes you kind of reset the engagement to just be a long. Sorry, I mean delete some of this. Yeah, so like turn 2 onwards, like if you break through, you get to reset the engagement like this, and that's a much easier like it's a lot harder for your opponent to basically flow through on the sides to try to flank you than on a long board edge, which is much easier. Um, Now, like obviously, I'm not going into nitty-gritty detail, but like how to deploy correctly and so forth for this mission and like by units and units. But I'm hopefully trying to explain some concept of like how you want to basically fight this mission. If you're going basically facing a double, I think it doesn't really change too much if you're on the bottom of the turn. I think it's more in fact you can also act the same way and just wait because then you can just give your opponent the ability to go top of the turn. Now, the crucial part though is it's going to be hard to like want to allow a situation in which your opponent can get 1 point ahead of you because might not be to score 3, but depending on the armies, like the players might not be able to really necessarily put a lot of pressure on this point here because they're trying to keep their kind of wall like intact here. So they might reach this one with this one. It's I'm realizing could be drawing something really bad on screen, but the point here is I'm saying is that like it's you don't want to commit big resources early in the game to try to get 3 points. You want to commit as little resources as possible, even if you're going into the turn with potential double, because in my experience is taking advantage of double doesn't early in the game and not pan out the same way. Because let's think about like what would happen in this case, right? Your opponent sets up here, kind of, or basically his position here. He's challenging he's scoring these 2 objectives. And then he's got this one by just like tippy toeing in there. Well, your plan is you have this one and this one free, but the only really easy one to get is this one, potentially if they're just tiptoeing in, or this one here, because it's going to be very hard to get your opponent's one. If you're trying to make a gun for it with basically any chaff unit, you're probably giving up chaff unit, which means you're giving up gaining momentum, battle tactic, or eye front, any kind of the easy battle tactics, right? But if you're gunning for the center one, you can kind of commit like, hey, this is my bulk of my forces. We're basically just grinding it on the center. So you're not really changing. No board state is really changing. You're just exchanging the center objective, and you're just waiting to see like how you can maximize your flankers because you're gonna want your opponent to like you need him to open up this side objective here, or even his home objective by having to fight and grind on the center. The more kind of like turtling they are in this corner, the less impactful a double will be because you're more likely than not going to basically fight the full brunt of their forces for most of the first half of the game and not necessarily getting you much value, especially if you sacrifice so many things that they can break through in the next 2 turns, basically claim your home objective and wash out any kind of maybe net gain of early point lead you had. So from that perspective, like it's just usually better to I honestly think it's just better for most players to just play like the wait and see game and just grind on the center and then try to force one player not to like overextend. Now, that's where the asymmetry of the game comes in, which is that like if you both operate on this framework, the army of like basically A, the superior battle tactic options, B, maybe if you're more of like a elite Death Starry build, like Archeon or Vanguard Bliss or whatever, like Chosen Slaves of Dark, whatever. Just think of like things that just beat stick very easily. Like they have a great advantage to push down the center. If you're more like a KO or like a Beast of Chaos type list, or even kind of, I guess have this kind of aspect of Bulgors, but if you're more like an edge, like you kind of like you still want to do this, but then like try to put pressure here, right? Because you can't necessarily pressure the center as much as you want, like because you're not winning this grinding game that's happening in the center. But if going back to that previous statement, like I see a lot of players just go down the center here. The problem is you can't get like if that grindy matchup is happening because of the source, and it's actually kind of hard to like navigate around the fights, and they can kind of block you, chaff units, and so forth. So in that regard, like I think it's much easier to basically try to fight a corner, and if your opponent decides to do the mirror your corner, even better. It just means now like you can like your chaff units and so forth are like fighting over here, and you're basically just playing the battle in this like square here. And then whoever's got some chaff units over here can fight. And then for all armies, that makes it like fundamentally easier to play. Not easier, but it makes it where the superior battle tactic options, the dice can maybe decide more of a winner, but mostly it's just waiting to see who makes a mistake first, right? Overextension in AOS, especially in the first two turns, will lose you more games than win you, and that means like basically by taking big, massive risk, right? There are some exceptions to that rule in the sense that like if you playing against an army that has a fast, super durable, like single model thing that can basically lock up your opponent's army in a corner, basically making it hard for them to readjust to how the battles of the fighting, it can be super impactful. But that's true for any mission. It's not just like this mission specifically. It's just the asymmetricness of fighting certain like archetypes against with certain archetypes. So, but in this mission, I truly believe like, hey guys, like don't deploy down the center, deploy off these corners here, and then fight this way. Just it's like a one directional commit basically, versus like you don't need to commit to like having choices. You have three objectives you can fight for, and versus like trying to fight for four, which is usually ends up overextending and also gives your opponent way too much space on the side, your flanks to over outmaneuver you. So that's my recommendation. I usually do. I usually sometimes I don't even put units on my home objective depending on mission, because some or some army I'm playing, because some armies get the benefit of, hey, if your opponent has more objectives than you can score this battle tactic. If you capture more objectives in the end of turn, so it can happen, but this is no like, especially if they make you go first, you're like, cool, I'm not on my objective, but his on there, so easy battle tactic turn one. But anyway, that's more faction specific things. And since all of these objectives are weighted equally in terms of winning condition for the primary points, like you don't really need to worry about like where placement is. You just need to be able to target three of them. Okay, so that was almost 15 minutes on just Price of Gallet. Holy shit, we're gonna be here for all day, boys. All right. Let me see. Realmstone Cache. Cool. Mission number 2. Okay. Um, this is this is almost a bipolar opposite mission from what we talked about earlier. Okay. How to approach Realmstone Cache. So, for the sake of time, I won't go into too much. I'm going to still talk about how you approach it from. Let's approach it from going first, because it's usually always the worst situation to be in, mechanically speaking, in the game. At least that's my opinion. So, how do you approach Realmstone Cache? So, first thing you'll notice is, by the way, for context, um, this popped up. These missions, or I should say, sorry, let me catch my word. On this visuals, all the objectives are trying to represent the weight of the size of them represents the weight of how much they influence the primary scoring points overall for the game. And while the center is technically, surprisingly, worse than the side objectives in the second turn, in the third and fourth, and because you can only score 4 points from the center, but you can score 9 points max from the split objectives. But so in terms of average, like I think a one objective off to the side is potential. Anyway, the point is, it's actually most people have this theory that the Realmstone Cache is all about controlling the center. It's more about controlling the second half of the game than it is controlling about the first half. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't care about the center. It just means that you don't have to commit all your resources into the center. In fact, it's probably better you don't. And I know that's maybe it's most people, maybe it's obvious for some folks, but it might not be obvious for some other folks. In terms of this, how this mission develops, you're gonna want, and it's just going to be reflective of even the previous conversation. It's okay to not do the center board deployment. I mean, in this mission, it's literally who can be more patient than the other player and not and not drop a battle tactic. Since the center objective, it's also super matchup dependent. There's some matchups if you play Gargants, it's so hard to get points, but Gargants also have a hard time getting battle tactics, so it's like kind of offset into the gameplay mechanic. But it's just you don't necessarily need the center objective to win the game. You just really can't draw battle tactics if you're going to do this. So setting up in this like basically frontal stage to tap this objective here is important. There's also the strategy of like, well, what if I just go all in and block my opponent off completely off the center? That's fine as long as you don't commit your entire army to doing that. Like if you can buy yourself a turn or make it hard, like if your opponent makes you go first and they like this, even if they charge you on the point, they can't get on the point, then great. Like that's a fantastic strategy. There's a few armies that can do that, but most armies can't physically do that for Realmstone Cache. And in fact, like some armies, good players that recognize that some armies can do that to them and they still have the drop advantage, they will choose to go first to prevent that from happening. And then you'll just have to, bid their time, and be careful for a double. But like, try not to fight like all your points in this pocket. The idea here is to just like, it's to literally, it's a wait and see mission. Like you're gonna want to fight here for a bit. Now there's my approach to this thing, and it's mostly because of the armies I play. I tend to pick a corner or a side, and then that way, in case like 3 or 4 drops, like I'm still able to, it's very easy to get to. But if 5 or 6 drops, I'm still fighting for 1 or 1 and 2. I'm still fighting for 1, but it makes it like much harder for me to get there. But because of the types of army I play, it's usually okay. Like KO just doesn't really care, but you do want to be able to like completely block your opponent's ability to reach easily, these two. So a third of the time I get super not punished. 2/3 of the time I could potentially get punished, but it also blocks my opponents. So it's a kind of a wash. I think a lot of players, they try to play this mission where you basically play in this pocket here, just wait and see. But depending on how your opponent like plays the game, it's very easy to take advantage of this placement, because especially if 5 or 6 comes down, a screens just make it impossible for you to readjust easily. You're like completely dependent on these corner ones to hit for this placement to work. It's so brutal. Like you almost have like when that split happens and you're in the state, you're almost like forced to take the prio so you can at least make a split. And the worst part about this split is that your armies like has to be kind of like sectioned off down the center. Now I know it's like oversimplification, because most players I think will deploy and play into the center here, and then have some flankers, potentially contesting this one if it splits here, or like have the ability to reach there. Like it's just a wait and see mission. Like don't overcommit to the center. The last thing you want to be doing is like fighting, having your opponent being able to like completely block you by engaging your army down the center, and when this, especially on turn 2, and then when the split happens on turn 3, especially if they're bottom of turn 2, and the split happens on turn 3, and I'm like, cool, I'm gonna give you the turn, and then you're stuck fighting the center. And if it's especially 5 or 6 hits, you're just screwed. So yeah, don't do that. uh, it's okay to fight for the center, just don't do it your entire army, and just know what your opponent's threat range is, so that way you don't get caught off guard for, basically being able to like them like kind of also like go behind your line and then just kind of like pile into combat to rope things into combat to prevent the mission in here is like wait and see for turn 3 and try to block your opponent's ability to A, score battle tactics, B, maneuver on 2 points on turn 3 onward. It's less about killing your opponent, basically, which I think is fundamentally how you're supposed to approach the game anyway. So that's Realmstone Cache. Cool, man. I should do it in like 10 minutes. All right. Let's go to Battleline Drawn. All right. I would love to describe the intricacies of this mission, but since scoring doesn't matter in this mission, it's annoying that the filter panel keeps on doing itself. Since scoring does not matter because of the way this mission is designed. Wait, hold up. I might be confusing with another mission. We're doing it live, boys. Let's see. Whoop, that's not what I want to share. Wikipedia. Do me solid. Pitch battle here. Yeah. Okay. No, I'm thinking of the other older mission that was super bad. So it's been, I don't have enough coffee in me yet for this recording. Their mission used to be like you basically you couldn't score battle attack or you couldn't get points. It didn't matter, but this mission actually does. So like all of these quarters are objectives, the intents and purposes of it. So in terms of like deployment strategy in this mission, it's mostly about permanently being able to win inside a quarter more of your opponent's units than your. It's probably even fine to just do the traditional kind of like Oomba Bunga approach of deployment, which is basically be 9 inches apart in the center, and then just have your chaff units kind of walk in here if you need to take the point, and then just try to put as much pressure on your opponent. So that way, if they so that you can take their territory, trade. Basically, you want to be able to like go back and forth in case of reserves and stuff like that. The deployment here is not very complex. I think the only thing you have to be really careful with is just reserve mechanic armies. Like it might be smart to like keep some one chaff unit or some like non-consent control JC heroes in the back to like kind of block their ability to arrive on your table quarter, so that way they can't use reserves to like maybe steal an objective away, the quarter away from you. But there isn't like that much strategy in terms of like planning your maneuvering for this mission. Also, like it's usually better, and this is a rare case where it's better to fight down the center because it lets you in a turn basically decide which corner you need to adjust your body count to claim it back or to take it. And most, some armies, like, I think it's going to be hard, like what Visa Calus is going to be a hard mission to beat them into, just because there's just, they don't really fight down the center. So you're kind of constantly at this like struggle point of like trying to figure out where they're putting their resources into. But, simultaneously, there's also like, and for more traditional armies, this is just do get out in the middle and see who basically has more models standing at the end of the game, right? By the end of the game. So not much strategy in terms of, I don't have really any consequential like thoughts into how to deploy for this mission. It's kind of self-oblivious or self-obvious for me. There isn't like any kind of sneaky things. Just be super conscientious of like your opponent's reserve mechanic and threat ranges, so you don't like sacrifice chaff units to basically the reach from their territory. And if you're playing an opponent that basically doesn't want to fight you in the center, even better for you because you get to just basically adjust, like I said, your model count to which quarter you need on whatever turn to take that quarter back. So, yeah, I think this is pretty easy. Like I think anybody can kind of figure that deployment. There's no secret here to reveal. Lurkers Below. Okay, this one is. I don't know how to describe this one. Uh, it's deployment for this one is, I would say, on par with the previous mission. From the this is the one where you basically need, you can't take the next objective until you've claimed the one before. So fundamentally, like, it's a very one-dimensional game of just going down the straight line. Uh, and the only thing that matters is like basically trying to score as many, like, since it's an auto win game, it doesn't really matter where you score in battle tactic. It's whoever basically scores all three objectives, and then I believe the tiebreaker is. I'm gonna hope it's battle tactics, but I rarely ever play this mission because it's terrible. Nope, 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 nope. Uh, it's whoever has completed their grand strat for tiebreaker. Wow, that is a garbage mission. Okay, screw scoring, guys. It doesn't matter. All right, so yeah, deployment, simple. Move down the center, be conscientious of their reserve mechanic so they don't snag your home objective back. Don't put yourself in a position in which they can take both both your home objective and the center objective in this. I don't think they can actually do that in the same turn, but they can definitely do that in a double turn situation, right? So be super conscientious of like a double turn in this. In fact, this is one of those missions. It's probably better to always be bottom of the turn, just to never open up that window of risk, right? But yeah, deployment. Hey, we're gonna nail this real quick. You're just moving as a castle, right? Like, it's just, you're just deploying everything in the center. I can't. The only, like, since battle tactics doesn't matter, who gives a shit about your chaff units? Use them to block movement. Use them to impede reserves. Like, it doesn't matter. This mission, I hate when they design missions where scoring doesn't matter. Good talk. Good talk, guys. Now we're getting into some more of the interesting ones. So Presence of Idols is, it's also a very good mission. I wish it had a little bit more objectives on the board, but they're at least located in a good place. Since most of them are basically no man's land, or territory places where you can't deploy on. It makes the game a lot more interesting because you're forced to fetch and not stay. But in terms of approaching that mission, one of the big things about like Presence of Idols, there's the additional kill mechanic gives another primary point. So it's going to be super matchup dependent of how that works. Try not, my rule of thumb is, I know people like to give Presence of Idols to the killiest thing they have. I don't think it's wrong. I just think it's also better to also give it to things that are fundamentally hard for your opponent. Like, if you don't really consistently have the super killy things, just try not to give it to things that are relatively easy to kill. Basically, it's my only advice. It's there. I think most people can discern that. I employed deployment for this mission. I do, basically a feint flank, or whatever you want to call it. You typically, I'll use the attacker box here for this example. I'll try to do this, right? So I have most of my resources here, and then I have like a small pocket of resources here, usually fast one. The distance here is 15 inches. The distance here is 11 inches. So you only need to walk 5 inches to contest a point here. You need to work 9 inches to contest a point here. So in terms of which objective you should be fighting for, you should probably be fighting for the one that's like super short to walk to, because you're probably going to want to basically fight on this kind of like pocket here, over these two objectives. And it's the thing about this mission I like is that your opponent, if he applies the same logic, wants to fight over here. So what ends up happening is you get this cycle of both players re-meeting back in the center. It's kind of like this like dance you're both doing across both that. So the important thing about these like chaff units is being able to threaten this objective, but also in the later turns, like being able to act as like a movement blocker, so that way you can reposition your stuff in a way where maybe you can even get behind them in the second half of the game. But for the most part, like, it's just like, yeah, you want to focus fighting on these on if you're the attacker position, on these two objectives, and then this one is your third priority. But really, it's just the units you're contesting it with is just to move block your opponents, because most opponents are going to try to do this, mimic the same strategy in reverse, because that's how the positional states works. If they're trying to push down the center, it's really easy for you to just readjust based on like the resource commitment. Like since you commit most of your resources here, and then you're, let's say 60% and 40% here, or 30% technically, and then 10% here. Like it's just like literally like it's easy for that 30% to like wheel back around if it needs to. Your opponent, especially if your opponent is trying to do this kind of like force push down the center, it's less like it's completely depending on the asymmetry of the matchup. Like if they have the damage output and they have the double turn situation in their favor, they can definitely make that happen. But it's also like it requires them. Most armies like 80 to 80% resource commitment to do that. So you always have that like 10 to 15% you can basically pressure that point with, that they might not have like necessarily the easy way of dealing with it. And even if they take the center, if you just still have the edge objectives, like you're doing just fine. Does not matter. The question is how long can you hold on to them while scoring points, right? And your rent strat. So if you're facing a lot, like if you're facing a losing kind of game in terms of sequence, how the fights are going, it's okay, because in this mission you can make up for it by just basically board position advantage more than just necessarily killing your opponent. But yeah, that's how I advise this mission, and I think I see a lot of players do this. They try to reserve and deep strike things over here in your territory, because you got some squishy, let's just say squishy things behind your line, but you don't care. When your opponent does this, you don't care. They're so far away from any objectives that like they don't matter. It's like every time I see an opponent do this, I'm like, why? Like even if you make the 9-inch charge or whatever charge distance you need, like I don't think this buys you very much. Like you're basically whatever X percentage of resources you've committed here is never going to be on these points, at least fast enough to be relevant. And if you're really worried about your opponent getting to your squishy side, it's really easy to just have like one small screen blocking it. But honestly, I don't even think you should care. It's such a gamble, and you rarely ever get any value for this move. Every time I've seen somebody do this, I just walk away. Even if they make the charge, I'm like, I don't care. Like I need to fight on these points. As the famous Gavin Gragar has said, you got to fight in the circles, son. So yeah, this is not a good strategy. Do not recommend. So yeah, and the presence of idol it's one of my favorite missions, just because like mechanically speaking, it looks like you're gonna fight this way, but really what you fight ends up this way. At least that's how procedurally the game should probably go. From a like obviously like making that more commitment down the center is not like a wrong necessary decision, but it is a riskier play in my opinion for how the mission is designed. Okay, let's talk about Nidus Path. Cool. All right, another not. I don't hate this mission. I just don't. I think they introduce this complexity of the teleportation thing that like gets almost zero value. Um, Mostly mechanically speaking, it's just one of those things where once any resources you dedicate to doing the Nidus Path is also easily blocked and is only contesting this objective, and it's not even contesting it very well. So it's the same comment I had previously. It's just like it's less bad than the previous mission, but doing this almost buys you nothing, like at all. Um, they could arrive. You could like they could arrive here, and then you had no one in 12 inches for them to charge, so they came again on the point the turn they arrived. And even if they win priority, like they'd have to most of the time like run to get there. Unless you have some units on the point, they can just charge. But if you just sit on the opposite edge of it, it's like fundamentally for some units, it's kind of hard to get to, even of a charge distance. So it's not great. It's not great. uh, I don't think you should use Nidus Path corners very often. Obviously there's always an exception to the rule, but we're going to talk about how to deploy in this mission. um, so it's another mission where Since you can be 9 inches from the objectives, basically these corner ones here, and then 9 inches here. Some people like to approach it from like a 33, a third, like threat vectors, where you put a third of your army here, a third of your army here, a third of your army here. There's also the people like me who approach it more like, 60, 30, 10, or 60, 30, and 10. What that means is that like you put most of your resources into towards one objective, and then you basically split your flank. Now, I prefer the 60 or the most of them here, and here's the logic why. It's just that this distance between the two objectives here is shorter than the distance here. This is 22 inches. This is 30. So you had an 8-inch difference gap between both of them. And in case you win you win this fight, you can threaten their home objective very easily. And if your opponent mimics that, it's another basically trade-off, right? So the job of the 30% commitment here is to tag and then like roadblock your opponent. It's not to go fetch this objective. This is to fetch this objective. There is, so like I said, there is the idea of let me delete these. There is the idea of putting basically your 60% here. And the reason why is if you're this is more of a defensive play, because you're defending these two of these resources, and then you're 30 here, and then but your 30 here is more likely than not going to be boldest. I like keeping 10% down the center, just because it has a good movement blocking value on both sides. But really, it's also like, if your opponent's a super elite army, just having 10% just like running towards their home objective in the first half of the game makes it hard for them to just like basically forego defending this objective entirely. So that's worth them. And then if they're more of a reserve army, like having kind of this board state pressure than the center makes it really hard for them to deep strike on these side corner ones. I mean, I've used even that 30% to like even like block deep striking by leaving like trailing a unit back here this way, so they can't even arrive from this angle very easily. So it's from a perspective of like deployment, I think my personal take is the 60% commitment here, 60 to 70, depending how you really view it. And then your small commitment, small contingents here, and then your second bigger contingent here is a winning strategy more importantly than not, because you're trying. It's just a logic of like, this is a shorter path to their objective than going this way. But if you do the reverse, right, this is just a defensive play for both these. There is the idea of also doing a 50-50. You do 50 here, 50 here, and then you just use this 50 to like kind of defend these two. I don't know if that buys you enough pressure here to basically have a play on narrow objective early enough, because the idea is like you want to put pressure here as fast as possible, because it forces resources away from fighting over here, right? And then if they choose to not defend, it just means that now like you can play the kind of like more of the delay, and less about kill, right? So those are, once again, I think I'm not saying anything new revolutionary, but and these are once again my opinion on how you should approach defending these missions. Only the wormy. Hide the filter bar here because it keeps popping up. You have to change that setting later. So only the worthy is another really good mission. And the more objectives there are in a mission, the more interesting it gets. One of the things I really like about this mission is that Galatian champions are they are basically, from 40k speak, objective secured. They have the ability to claim an objective, and your opponent cannot claim that objective until he kills a Galatian champion and any other, mechanically speaking, any other Galatian champion you own on that objective. So no matter how many models he has on the point, or unless he has a Galatian champion that counts as more models than your Galatian champion, then this mission, like, you basically can't fight this mission very well. Now, in terms of you will come to no surprise. It is still a 1-2 more situation, and this is another mission where when talking about this, it's deploying in the bucket center. Not a very good strategy. It lets your opponent to dictate how he wants to pin you. So try to avoid that. We talked about this in pretty much in ad nauseum, I think, in the previous mission reviews. It's probably better to basically pick a corner of, like, let's say an 80% here and then a 20% resource here. Not necessarily like in the center board, but like maybe on this, like, more away. So if they want to chase down the 20 center, then you're not giving them the ability to fight back quickly enough. You want this 20% to fight away from your center objective, and your 80% to, like, challenge these two. The reason why you want the 20% to challenge these two is you want to be able to pressure this point enough in case you have a breakthrough opportunity to go threaten their home objective. Your opponent will basically try to replicate the same thing. And if an opponent does 100% commit to the center, and then tries to chase down your 80% so you can fight in your home objective, it's okay to just basically trade swap places here, and it leaves your 20% resources to do what they want to do, which is also flank maneuver around. You'll notice a lot of my strategies or about deployment are about, like, flanking or preventing flanking. It's just good. It's a good idea to not allow your opponent to dictate the forms of engagement as much as possible. While you might not get a choice because you're going first and they're going in the bottom of their turn, it's still hard. It's better to restrict their ability to maneuver, right? So, when you fight down the center, you're giving him basically this wide berth of angles they can approach from the center. And if you basically move the center up here, right, you reshift this way, what it basically just does for them is it gives them this wide gap and this wide gap. I prefer in this mission this position more than the center board position, because it's just, like, from their perspective, going this way or this way is much longer. Plus, you have your your threat vector over here that makes it hard for them to just necessarily pick this flank. You can even move block them if you really wanted to. So if this is the easy alleyway, you can set up your defense, your structure, most of your impact to this on this point very easily. I don't know. It's just the way I approach. These drawings probably don't do it very much good justice into it, but I advise people to not try to fight on their home objective as much as possible, because you will lose the game. You're ceding too much ground to your opponent by doing that. I think there's anything new and only the worthy I can explain. Once again, this is a mission also, depending on the asymmetricness of matchups, where if your opponent doesn't have a lot of JCs, he's going to be focusing on trying to kill them. But it's just having, like, one JC here and one JC here, bubble wrapped enough, makes it impossible for some armies to just basically easily, like, take them. So you're just playing kind of like this wait and see game. Obviously, armies with, like, reserves and so forth have, like, this advantage of, like, where, like, basically arriving here is, like, somewhat useful for them, or even here, because they're not that far away from like, this is also kind of like why I like the 20% over here, is it makes it hard for them to arrive on this corner. They can still arrive here, but if you're a little bit more conservative about your movement forward, they really can't reach this objective with the reserves. They can only reach this one. So yeah. All right, let's go to Path of a Champion. All right, Path of a Champion. Okay. Another great mission. This one actually values objectives outside your deployments way more in terms of scoring points than your home objectives. So it's actually, it wants you to fight on these objectives. The advantage for owning those outs, no man's land objectives is if you have a regulation champion contesting it and you own it, you can pick 2 battle tactics to score that turn, and that's having to some. It benefits some armies a lot more than others, unfortunately, because of how battle tactics have derived. But anytime you have the ability to score more points than your opponent, through battle tactics, it's a very good mechanic to have. And I know that sounds really stupid and simple to say, but that's just the truth. And the way you basically deploy this mission is very similar to the presence of idols. You're going to want to commit some resources here, most of your resources, here in a bucket. You could do the split 50-50. I prefer fighting, my 60%, 70% here, going in this direction, tagging these objectives, and then this one just basically adding pressure here or move blocking them from being able to flank me as I get further into their territory. You don't need to own both of these guys. What you do need to do is prevent a JC from contesting it. So like going in an armies that can remove JCs are like, they don't care about owning both. They just want to own one and then to remove your opponent's JCs from challenging the other one. So keep that in mind. I see people try to do the 50-50 split here. It's never going to work for you guys. It's just an opponent that if you do 50-50 first, like, hey, this is a long distance versus this distance here, and the instant you do that, you're basically splitting your forces in two. Your opponent here really only needs to commit to all of his resources into one commitment. So I highly recommend do not do that. It's easier to show a solid front and then a weaker flank, because if they're more committing to the weaker flank, that's okay. It gives you more free pressure down here. And your weaker flank isn't trying to engage. It's trying to commit resources away from this and away from fighting you, right? So maybe I'm just running out of steam, but I'm going through these. I feel a lot faster. We're almost up to an hour. Holy God. Listening to me for an hour must be super draining. The Jaws of Gallet. Cool. So Jaws. This one, so this is the mission where going second on from turn 2 onward gives you the ability to remove an objective off the table. This mission is, because I'm always of the school of going second, and maintaining that sequencing of order, just super plays into that play style, right? And we talked about this previously on a different episode, but you'll notice like the center objective is super heavily weighted, as well as the kind of like these corner objectives, and their home objectives is not. In fact, your home objective might as well be fucking useless for the most part. To be honest, it's because if your opponent goes second on turn 2, they're more likely than not to delete your home objective off the cuff anyway, unless they're doing this weird strategy where they're not fighting in the center and they're fighting on the corners, and they're more likely to just delete the center objective. But that's always been a weird strategy in my head, because it just leaves your center forces to just recommit to a different, and your opponent's army is completely spit and win in fights. So I don't know if I really understand that maneuver. In terms of deployment, it's similar here. It's 60-40. It's going to come up very apparent to you guys. It's like that kind of like 70-30, 60-40 works for me. Logic is distance. It's always distance. It's just basic geometry. This is faster to get here. This is fast, and you're also here. And then this is also, this distance is closer than that distance. It's just simple geometry. There's nothing like revealing about like why you fight, like you dedicate resources this way, but approaching it that's just how I approach the resource investment. Because if I have 60% of my forces here, and then 40%, like think about it, think about the board split in half, right? So I have 60% here and then 40% on this side of the board. Worst case scenario, if my opponent does the same thing and rematches, it just ends up being going this way. you basically just end up finding, like, back into this weird state we talked about before, in the presence of idols, where you're just kind of like trading. The difference is whoever goes second gets to burn objectives, and this is where it comes in super crucial. Turn 2 and turn 3 are the most important, like, priority roles. You want to go second. You want to be able to, if depending how I view this mission works, is if you win priority turn 2 and you choose bottom of the turn, you can easily choose to delete this objective and then bring your 40 back in the center. And then at any point, if if your opponent wins priority, at this point he's stuck basically deciding, am I winning the center, and if not, do I delete your opponent's objective? Like, hopefully they have the ability to maybe tag it to take it away from you, but mechanically speaking, like, it's pretty good to, like, if you're playing and I should say this is more from a Castle kind of melee build, grinder build, it's putting yourself in a position to burn a corner objective early is more valuable, because over the way just the game is going to progress. So if you turn 3, he wins priorities, he's either deleting your home objective or the center, or even the corner over here. But you're still in, like, a good space to, like, basically continuously challenge all 3. Now, if you do this and they win priority and they make you go top of turn on turn 2 and they delete your corner objective here, well, like, it's just I don't think you should commit your forces to go fight this corner objective. You just basically, like, split some of your resources to go fight this, to go claim their home objective, and then you just use the rest and the 40% to support the, kind of create this, like, embargo state for them, and then you hope to win like, to be honest, you can't win this mission if you keep losing priorities and going first. Like, it's so hard to win this mission if that happens. But we're not going to imagine a world where that happens all the time. And if it does happen, like, how do you hedge your bet against it? And this is exactly how you hedge your bet against it. You want to be able to, if your opponent keeps making you go first, you want to try to box him in as much as possible and put board pressure on all the objectives that are remaining. The last thing you want to do is make it easy for him to just know exactly which objective to delete every turn. It's just that if you give him that too much of that power, it means that you're not in a good board state position. Okay, let's talk about Hours for the Taking. One of my new favorite missions, because I played this mission a ton. So this probably doesn't do it justice. I was trying to figure out why to edit this, but because I weighted these ratios for values based completely agnostic on who's playing, be it you're a defender or attacker. To be honest, if you're a player, your home objective is like garbage. It's garbage. Here's why. Your home objective gets you at most 5 points. The center objective gets you at most 10 points. Your opponent's objective gets you 10 points. These two objectives gets you 20. This one gets you 5. So 5 out of 25 is 20%, right? Yeah, 20%. This is 20% of points here. This is 80%. You almost fundamentally never want to fight for your home objective. You might want to delay your opponent's ability to take it, but you almost never want to fight for your home objectives. So how does that look like from a deployment perspective? Well, one of the ways I like to do it is, firstly, key takeaway for getting that 2 points in the center objective requires JCs, meaning that you're probably going to set up like this. And then a big chunk of resources here. So, because you kind of want this to walk this way, and you kind of want this to walk this way, potentially even this way, and you're basically creating this vector thread. And if your opponent knows and follows the same guideline philosophy, he's also not putting a lot of resources here. So you're going to want this, like, heavy commitment to resource here, whatever it is, to just be able to swing back to there's a center as quickly as possible. But the idea here is that if he does defend his home objective very heavily, you want to be able to take it. Because every resource he commits on defending a 20% of primary point objective means it's less resources fighting here, and it's less resources fighting here. It's a disproportionate representation of scoring and resource management is what it ends up becoming. So most of the cases, like it's just going to end up being this. You're going to effectively, if you both all adhere to that same logic, you're fighting the game like, oh no, let me delete this so I can more represent it. You're fighting the game like this. You're trading home objectives and you're fighting over the center, and that's how the mission should play out. Just because of us points. Once again, super advantageous to armies of JCs versus none, because like I said, a consistent 2-point score in the center and a 2-point score in your home objective is super advantageous. I think I've seen players try to defend their home objective. I don't think it works very well. It just doesn't, like, not having the resources to take your opponent's home objective. Now their logic is like, if I can defend my home objective and break your attack, I can then reclaim the home objective easily. But I think that's a fallacy in timing, in my opinion. But you're losing too many points early in the game and not necessarily having a huge ramification for the second half of the game. The worst case too is if you're doing this strategy and you let's say your opponent on the center gets to break through your stuff that's trying to fight on the center, they can also just go completely block you off from moving to the center or re-engage and like get to your soft side behind wherever they're grinding it. I honestly believe like most fighting for, if I was going to split the map, if I was going to split the map in this down the center like I did last time and explain where resources should be, there should be 80% resource on this half. Whoop, super great writing. And 20% on this half. And vice versa for your opponent, right? That's just how I look at this, like resource management. This is 80% of points. This is 20% of the points. You should match your resources to the amount of primary point you're generating. Like, I don't know why I think this way. I think I attribute it to poker strategy. Like you should not overcommit to hands that don't have big value. And this is the same reason why I don't want to overcommit to, defending my home objective of more than 20% of my commits. If you can defend your home objective of less than 20%, you're doing fantastic. Yeah, it means that like literally means like most of your army's fighting the places it needs to fight. And I think I've had games where I think I've had, let's see, point wise, yeah, I have had like 10% of my army defend my home objective for at least 2 consecutive battle rounds, even sometimes 3, and that's so much value in terms of how the game evolves. Still the game is asymmetric, so it doesn't like necessarily translates to a win, but I think that's the right philosophy in approaching how to win that mission and how to deploy. Twists and turns. The worst mission they've written in the new set. It's honestly not that bad. I wish the map was more fit more better, but it's fine, whatever. It's just that I see, mechanically speaking, it's just I've seen it like punish so many players in terms of how the randomness happens, and it's not necessarily good. And you can't really tell, but the corner objectives were worth less points than the center objectives, basically, and the center is worth the most points. And it's just a logic of how you basically have to approach how you win that mission, because you're more likely to get rolls happening in the center than the corners, at least activation rolls. It's on a 4-up, but so objectives turn up during your turn. Start your phase on the 4-up, and if you have a JC sitting on it, it turns on a 3-up. And then at the end of your turn, you roll for every active objective. On a 4-up, they turn off, or a 3-up, I believe, if you're having a JC on it. But in terms of like scoring potential and how you deploy on this, it's just another example of symmetry. You're gonna want, because distance here is a short, you're gonna want let's split the map into this format. You want, let's say, 20% here, 80% here, and the 80% wants to fight in this window specifically because it can always readjust this way. So just the way I internalize, resource and scoring. Just I want to be able to fight on 3 objectives, which greatly magnifies my odds of getting an active objective. But also because your opponent is also needs to more likely to, he's not going to fight in the corners because a split army just dies, or just doesn't procedurally do well. So you're fighting. He's also activating objectives more consistently as well as you. So like you're gonna want to fight on these 2, maybe even these 2. But you're probably better off fighting on these 2 if you're the defender, right? Reverse for the attacker. He wants to fight over here. The defender wants to fight over here, right? In this mapping. Just the way progressively the missions deployment is. And I know, like, I probably, if you were going to fast forward to this part, I covered a lot of explanation as to why resource allocation matters in terms of how the missions play, in terms of primary points, or how much the impact the objectives have over the mission. So I've covered those in the previous battle plans. I won't repeat them too much here because I think people are tired of hearing me talk. But yeah, in terms of like how to approach this mission, you're going to want to deploy most of your resources towards the objectives that are closer to you, and the lesser part of your points to objectives which are farther from you, in a sense, right? Because, once again, if you deploy your weaker side here, the distance here is 15 inches, 11 inches here. Now you could reverse the logic to say, I'm going to fight 80% here as a counter to the point. It's not really buying you much per se, like maybe in the early game, but in the fundamental part of the game, like you don't want to sacrifice distance because you need to hold your line into a way where you're more concentrated in terms. I mean, the distance between the 2 objectives here are the same, but fundamentally the reach here is shorter, meaning you can have a tighter board control state for those 2 objectives. Versus here, it just means that you have to move way more to you wheel your basically your front position. And it's it's just also like in terms of flanking maneuver, it's a lot harder for them to go this way versus them going this way. it's just there is just I think it's more important to do it that way, but it's just basic geometry, or at least that's what I consider basic geometry. All right, position over power. Another very interesting mission. This one is the way I explain it to folks. Pick 1 flank objective. Don't pick 2 flank objectives unless you're like a very reserved army and you can dedicate very little resources to them. But typically, like most armies don't have that ability. So if you're a more traditional, like kind of like move army and like less reservy, you're gonna want to commit to 1 flank objective. Which obviously is a problem because your opponent can counter react to that just by you're like, oh, you're gonna free up this objective here, then I'll just take it. But that's okay. Like the flank objectives are important, but they're not that important as long as you can claim 1, right? It's just it most of the game point wise ends up being important from these 2 objectives because these objectives disappear eventually. I think on turn 3, if I remember correctly. So if you think about it this way, these only score for 2 turns. These score for 3 turns, and having both of them gives you max points. So mechanically speaking, you're gonna want to, whatever objective you pick as if your flank objective, you're gonna commit resources to. You're gonna want to basically do this, right? It's like your flow of operation. You try to defend your home objective as much as possible with putting in a little bit of like potential risk pressure into your opponent's home objective, and then you have some resources challenging the flank. Not too much though. Like it's okay, I think, to probably be down a point or 2 going into the second half of the mission, as long as you can clearly own both your opponent's objective. Because if they spend too much time and resources trying to go for both flank objectives, they're not in a good position. If they're doing the same thing, you just end up like as you are. You're just ending up to play what's it called? The game just ends up becoming this once again this short board edge game where basically I noticed the filter bar is still up. You're playing this game where you end up like turn 3 onward, you're just basically playing each other and your lines are like this, right? I'd rather be the first one here than the second one here. in the second half of the game. Just lets you control a little bit more flow of the operation, in terms of if you want to go second or first when that happens. But yeah, it's there's also the school thought of just basically saying fuck it and just go down the center, and then like so you get like 90% here and you just go boom, and then you use 10% reserve or whatever like flank to go take a flank objective. Your opponent just could do the exact same thing, so you just end up rolling down the center. Or if he just gives it up and then like commits like let's say 20%, double what you committed here, and then like the rest of his army to fight here, that's good for you anyway, because you're set up for, if you're going to win this attrition game down the center for the second half of the game, you're basically, it's really hard for your opponent at that point to basically take those objectives back easily, especially if you get if you win any priority rolls right in that second half of the game. So I think it's super, like, that's how I would play the mission. I mean, caveat, obviously, like, I'm still talking as if you're not basically playing like a mostly reserve army or super fast, high speed elite army. I think if you're playing like KO and so forth, you're always going to be playing for like flank objectives anyway, just because like your army operates kind of that framework. And then as soon as you basically get the flank objective on turn like 2 or whatever, you just basically start pressuring the defender's objective. You just start picking off their weak under half as much as possible for the later turns, since you're an army that basically doesn't really project strength without actually engaging. And then if you're more of an elite army like Vanguard style builds, you're probably going to try to go down the center anyway, because you are more efficient at killing these kind of, you get a lot more value from engaging early because of your double activation, all your buffs and so forth. So you're probably trying to fight through the aggression anyway, and you're applying to this play for the first half. So in that case, if you're a defender and you're facing that kind of army, super efficient at fighting down the center, it's about like at this point like making a flank play is like just one flank play is it's good enough, right? You're gonna have to basically, if you commit too many resources to fight for both flanks while they're barreling down your objectives, you're more likely to just, while you're getting that early point lead, you're more likely to just lose the second half of the game. Unless you're able to readjust this flank, the way I look at it is if they're playing this way and you do like a 40-60 split again, resources, your one objective, your 40 split can go, you're putting that Vanguard positioning in a weird state, because as soon as they want to maybe potentially break through, you got 40% challenging their home objective. So I don't know. The asymmetry of the game is challenging to come up with a deployment plan for every army, and how you counter it. But there is the idea of, like, once again, it's completely, you could just have to look at how you want to spend your resources of your army versus like the scoring capability of the mission, at least on the board state presence. All right, 1 hour and 15 minutes. That was going to take a little bit longer, but that's still a long time for listening to me talk. So I hoped you liked this video. I honestly, I try to put a little, like, my goal here for the channel is to not be specific about the strategies and tips for specific armies. I don't think it's useful for anyone. So if you felt like it was not very useful for you because you were looking for something a little more deep dive, I apologize. It's just unfortunately that, like, I do not think it's valuable for anyone to basically get that level of information from this channel. It's just like, I want to keep it abstract enough to be useful, but I don't want it to be specific enough to only tailored for a certain audience, because I think anybody can look at these concepts and walk away with something useful. And if you already know it, I apologize, but you're probably better than most players I'm probably talking to here. And in fact, I could probably learn something as well from those individuals. So thanks for watching. Thanks for putting up with the hour and 15-minute deployment conversation. It really turned into more deployment and how to attack the game from the first half and second half, which is, I think, if you learn anything about deployment, that's how you're supposed to think about deployment. It's how does it work in your overall strategy of the game. and how, obviously, like deploying to not get punished by your opponent's power and speed and threats and so forth. Those are things that we can go in nitty-gritty details into, like positioning and models. But at the fundamentally of the day, it's just like it's based on your knowledge. You need to ask questions. If you don't know what your opponent's army does or units, ask questions. Get the full understanding of what it is, but don't let it impede your overall strategy and to how you're going to approach the mission and how you need to score points. You can deploy it to become defensive about how they can reach you, but you should not be so conservative and defensive that you are putting yourself in a place where you cannot score points. So, with that said, have a lovely rest of your Sunday, and I'll see you again soon.